At a small, bustling private airport in Los Angeles, the morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac. Greg Anderson, a seasoned pilot with years of experience under his belt, was going through his usual pre-flight routine. Known for being meticulous and disciplined, Greg prided himself on running a tight operation. He believed that following rules wasn't just important, it was essential. To him, every detail mattered, from checking fuel levels to ensuring passenger manifests were accurate. On this particular day, Greg had been assigned to oversee a charter flight scheduled to depart at noon. The aircraft was sleek and luxurious, the kind reserved for high-profile clients or corporate executives. As he flipped through the manifest, something caught his eye. A name that seemed oddly out of place. Listed as a last-minute addition was Calvin Broadus Jr. Greg frowned slightly. Who was this person? He didn't recognize the name, nor did it sound familiar from any previous flights he'd handled. Shrugging it off, he assumed it must be some celebrity trying to hitch a ride without much notice. Little did Greg know, this seemingly ordinary assignment would soon spiral into chaos. What he didn't realize, because no one had told him, was that the plane itself belonged to none other than Snoop Dogg, one of the most iconic figures in music history. Calvin Broadus Jr., better known by his stage name, had purchased the jet years ago and used it regularly for personal travel. But today, due to a simple miscommunication between the airline staff and Greg, the pilot remained completely unaware of this critical detail. As Greg finished inspecting the aircraft, he glanced at his watch. Passengers would start arriving soon, and he wanted everything to run smoothly. He adjusted his uniform, checked his clipboard one final time, and headed toward the boarding area. His mind buzzed with thoughts about safety protocols and schedules, but there was no hint of what lay ahead. Meanwhile, outside the terminal, Snoop Dogg and his entourage were pulling up in a convoy of luxury cars. Dressed casually in a tracksuit and sunglasses, Snoop stepped out with his signature laid-back swagger. His team carried bags and equipment, chatting animatedly as they made their way toward the gate. They were used to traveling like this. For them, hopping onto a private jet was as normal as grabbing coffee in the morning. None of them expected anything unusual to happen today. Back inside, Greg stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, scanning each passenger as they approached. Most were regular business travelers dressed in suits, carrying briefcases and laptops. Everything seemed fine until Snoop appeared. At first glance, Greg thought nothing of it. He assumed this tall, relaxed man was just another traveler. However, when Snoop handed over his ID, something felt off. Why would someone like him, clearly famous, judging by his demeanor and entourage, be flying on such short notice? And why hadn't anyone mentioned it earlier? Greg's instincts kicked in. Something wasn't adding up. Determined to avoid any potential issues, he decided to investigate further. Little did he know this decision would set off a chain of events neither he nor Snoop could have anticipated. What should have been a straightforward boarding process was about to turn into a scene straight out of a comedy movie. As the passengers began making their way toward the boarding area, Greg stood near the entrance with his clipboard in hand, watching each person carefully. He greeted them politely, but kept a sharp eye on everyone who approached. Most travelers were dressed in business attire, carrying briefcases or laptops looking like typical charter flight passengers. Everything seemed normal, until Snoop Dogg arrived. Snoop walked up to the gate with his entourage trailing behind him. Dressed casually in a tracksuit and sunglasses, he carried himself with an unmistakable air of confidence and ease. His laid-back demeanor stood out among the more formal crowd, drawing attention from both the passengers waiting nearby and the airport staff. As he handed over his ID to Greg, there was no hint of arrogance in his tone. Instead, he greeted the pilot warmly, saying, "Hey man, good to see you." But Greg wasn't convinced. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him. Why would someone as famous as Snoop Dogg be flying on such short notice? And why hadn't anyone informed him ahead of time? Determined to follow protocol, Greg glanced at the ID and then back at the manifest. The name matched, Calvin Broadus Jr., but that meant little to Greg. He had never heard of this alias before, and it raised more questions than answers. Politely but firmly, Greg addressed Snoop. Sir, I need to verify your credentials before you board, he said, holding up the passenger list. His voice was calm but authoritative, betraying none of the uncertainty brewing inside him. Snoop tilted his head slightly, his expression shifting into a bemused grin. Man, I don't think y'all understand. I own this plane, he replied smoothly, chuckling softly as if the whole thing were some kind of misunderstanding. Greg blinked, taken aback by the claim. Owns the plane? That couldn't be possible. Could it? Shaking off his surprise, he remained steadfast. I'm sorry, sir, but I'll need further proof, he responded, maintaining his professional demeanor. Snoop's team quickly stepped forward, pulling out documents they thought would resolve the issue. One of them handed over paperwork, showing ownership of the aircraft complete with official stamps and signatures. Despite the evidence, Greg hesitated. To him, these papers could have been forged. After all, identity fraud wasn't unheard of, especially when dealing with high-profile individuals. He glanced around nervously, aware that other passengers were now watching the exchange with growing curiosity. Some even pulled out their phones, snapping photos and recording videos of the unfolding scene. The tension grew thicker with each passing moment. Snoop's entourage exchanged glances, clearly frustrated by the delay. One of them muttered under their breath, "This is ridiculous." But Snoop himself stayed composed, leaning in closer to Greg with a patient smile. "Look, man, I ain't trying to cause no trouble," he said calmly, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. "You can call whoever you gotta call, but we're getting on this plane." Greg felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. Part of him wanted to believe Snoop's claim, but years of strict adherence to rules held him back. If he let them board without absolute certainty, he'd be putting himself, and potentially everyone else, at risk. On the other hand, turning away someone who might actually own the jet seemed equally problematic. Passengers waiting nearby began whispering among themselves, speculating about what was happening. A few laughed quietly, finding humor in the absurdity of the situation. Others looked annoyed, wondering how long the holdup would last. Meanwhile, Snoop's manager stepped forward, his tone firmer this time. "Listen, buddy, you're causing a scene here. Either sort this out now or prepare for legal consequences." The weight of the situation pressed down on Greg. He knew he needed clarification, and fast. Reaching for his radio, he contacted his supervisor, hoping for guidance. What he didn't realize yet was that this phone call would change everything. For now, though, all he could do was stand his ground, caught between duty and doubt while the world watched and waited. The tension at the boarding gate was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Passengers waiting in line exchanged glances, some whispering nervously while others openly stared at the unfolding drama. Greg, still clutching his clipboard, felt the pressure mounting. Every second that passed seemed to stretch longer than the last. Snoop Dogg's calm demeanor hadn't wavered, but his entourage was growing visibly agitated. They shifted their weight from foot to foot, exchanging irritated looks and muttering under their breath. Snoop, however, remained composed. He leaned casually against the railing near the gate, one hand resting on his hip, the other holding his sunglasses. His laid-back posture contrasted sharply with the escalating tension around him. "Man, I'm telling you, I own this plane," he repeated, his voice steady but tinged with amusement. "You can call whoever you need to call, but we're not leaving until this gets sorted." Greg hesitated, torn between two conflicting instincts. On one hand, he couldn't ignore the possibility that something suspicious was going on. What if this man wasn't really Snoop Dogg? What if someone was, trying to impersonate the rapper to gain access to the aircraft? The thought sent a chill down his spine. But on the other hand, what if this was Snoop Dogg? Refusing entry to an actual owner of the jet would be catastrophic, not just professionally but personally. Yet, without definitive proof, Greg refused to back down. "Sir, I understand your frustration," Greg said finally, his tone firm but polite. "But I have a responsibility to ensure everything is above board. Until I confirm your identity beyond any doubt, I can't allow you to board." This statement didn't sit well with Snoop's team. One of them stepped forward, his voice sharp and clipped. "Listen, buddy, do you even know who you're dealing with? This is Snoop Dogg, one of the biggest names in music. You think someone like him has time for games? We've got places to be, and this delay is unacceptable. Passengers, right nearby, murmured in agreement, though opinions were mixed. Some nodded sympathetically, clearly siding with Snoop's group. Others seemed to admire Greg's determination to stick to the rules no matter how awkward things got. A middle-aged woman leaning against her luggage whispered loudly to her companion, "I mean, it's better to be safe than sorry, right?" Her friend shrugged, unsure what to think. Meanwhile, the situation began drawing even more attention. Phones clicked and flashed as people recorded videos of the standoff. Someone posted a clip online, and within minutes, comments started pouring in. Social media users debated whether Greg was being overly cautious or admirably thorough. Memes mocking the incident began circulating almost instantly, turning what should have been a private matter into a public spectacle. Back at the gate, Snoop tried a different approach. With a laugh that carried just the right mix of charm and disbelief, he said, "Yo, man, you ever hear of Google? Pull up my picture real quick. It'll save us all a lot of trouble." The crowd chuckled, and even Greg cracked a small smile, though he quickly masked it. Humor aside, the core issue remained unresolved. As the minutes ticked by, tempers flared. Snoop's manager stepped forward again, this time with a thinly veiled threat. "Look, pal, if you don't fix this soon, there will be consequences, legal ones. Do you really want that headache?" The words hung heavy in the air, putting Greg further on edge. He knew they weren't bluffing. People like Snoop Dogg had resources most could only dream of. Still, he couldn't bring himself to budge without confirmation. Desperate for clarity, Greg radioed his supervisor once more. "I need verification ASAP," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. "There's a passenger here claiming ownership of the aircraft, but I need proof before I let him through." As he waited for a response, he glanced at Snoop, whose expression had shifted slightly. The rapper's usual easygoing smile was now tinged with exasperation, though he still managed to keep his cool. For Greg, the stakes had never felt higher. If he made the wrong call, it could cost him his job, or worse. But standing there, surrounded by curious onlookers and a growing sense of unease, he realized something else. Whatever happened next would define this moment for both him and the man standing across from him. And neither of them could afford to lose. Within moments, the standoff between Greg and Snoop Dogg had transformed from a tense misunderstanding into a full-blown media sensation. Passengers continued recording videos on their phones, capturing every word exchanged between the two men. The footage spread like wildfire across social media platforms, sparking debates and discussions among thousands of viewers. Some praised Greg for his unwavering commitment to protocol, calling him a hero for standing firm against what they assumed was an imposter. Others mocked him mercilessly, labeling him clueless or out of touch for not recognizing one of the most famous musicians in the world. Comment sections lit up with jokes and memes at Greg's expense. One viral post featured a picture of Snoop Dogg with the caption, "When you get blocked from boarding your own plane." Another showed a confused-looking dog with text that read, "This is my jet, I think." The internet reveled in the absurdity of the situation, turning it into a source of endless entertainment. Meanwhile, hashtags like "blocked from my own jet" and "Snoopgate" trended worldwide, ensuring the story reached far beyond the confines of the airport. Back at the gate, Greg finally received a response from his supervisor. After confirming details, with the airline's headquarters, the message came through loud and clear. The jet indeed belonged to Snoop Dogg. As the reality of the situation sank in, Greg felt a wave of dread wash over him. His cheeks flushed red, and he gripped his clipboard tightly, trying to steady himself. For all his talk about rules and verification, he now realized how badly he'd misjudged the situation. Summoning every ounce of professionalism he could muster, Greg approached Snoop and his team. "Mr. Broaddus," he began, his voice tinged with embarrassment, "I owe you an apology. It appears there was a miscommunication, and I failed to recognize the ownership of this aircraft earlier. Please accept my sincerest apologies for the inconvenience." To Greg's immense relief, Snoop responded with grace and humor. Flashing his signature laid-back smile, he replied, "It's all good, man. Mistakes happen. Just glad we got things sorted out before y'all called security on me." The crowd erupted in laughter, easing the tension that had been building for nearly an hour. Even Snoop's entourage seemed to relax, their earlier frustration melting away as they joined in the lighthearted mood. Passengers waiting nearby clapped and cheered, some even asking Snoop for selfies as he made his way toward the jet. The atmosphere shifted dramatically, from hostility to celebration, as people marveled at how smoothly the rapper had handled the entire ordeal. Despite being inconvenienced, Snoop never lost his cool, proving once again why he was beloved by fans around the globe. For Greg, however, the weight of the moment lingered. As the group disappeared onto the plane, he stood rooted to the spot, replaying the events in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation that came with realizing he doubted someone so iconic, but more than that, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for Snoop's patience, for the lack of lasting consequences, and for the fact that the situation hadn't spiraled further out of control. As the engines roared to life and the jet prepared for takeoff, Greg retreated to the cockpit, where he sat alone with his thoughts. Outside, passengers who had witnessed the drama shared their experiences online, adding fuel to the firestorm of reactions. Memes continued to multiply, and news outlets picked up the story, dubbing it the ultimate mix-up and a lesson in humility. Despite the whirlwind of attention, Greg knew the hardest part was yet to come. Once the initial buzz died down, he'd have to face the aftermath, both professionally and personally. But for now, as the plane carrying Snoop Dogg ascended into the sky, Greg allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. What started as a routine day had turned into something extraordinary, leaving him with lessons he'd carry for the rest of his career, and perhaps his life. As the jet carrying Snoop Dogg soared into the sky, Greg found himself sitting alone in the cockpit of another plane, staring out at the empty runway. The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on his shoulders. He replayed every moment in his mind, the initial suspicion, the standoff, the growing tension, and finally, the humbling realization that he'd made a grave mistake. It wasn't just the embarrassment that gnawed at him. It was the knowledge that his rigid adherence to protocol had almost turned a simple misunderstanding into something far more damaging. For hours after the incident, Greg couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Passengers who had witnessed the drama whispered about him as they boarded other flights, some casting sympathetic glances, while others smirked knowingly. Social media hadn't been kind either. Scrolling through his phone during a quiet moment, Greg saw countless memes and comments mocking him for failing to recognize Snoop Dogg. One post joked, "Even pilots need Spotify Premium," accompanied by a picture of Snoop's iconic face. Another quipped, "Next time, maybe ask Alexa instead of blocking the legend." While some comments defended his dedication to rules, the overwhelming majority poked fun at his expense. Despite the public ridicule, Greg knew the real challenge lay ahead. Word of the incident quickly reached his employer, and within hours, he was summoned to a meeting with senior management. Sitting across from his bosses, Greg braced himself for the worst, but to his surprise, they didn't fire him on the spot. Instead, they expressed disappointment, emphasizing how such situations could harm the company's reputation. They decided to reassign him temporarily to desk duty while they reviewed his performance, a decision that stung deeply, but was better than outright termination. The days that followed were tough. Greg avoided social gatherings, fearing judgment from colleagues and friends. Even routine tasks felt harder, knowing that people were talking behind his back. At home, he spent hours reflecting on the incident, dissecting every detail. He realized that while following rules was important, flexibility and communication mattered just as much. If only he'd taken a moment to listen more carefully or double-check earlier, the entire ordeal might have been avoided. Meanwhile, Snoop Dogg seemed unfazed by the chaos. During an interview later that week, he laughed off the incident, turning it into yet another story to add to his colorful life. "Man, I've seen it all," he said with a grin. "But getting blocked from my own plane, That's a first. His ability to laugh at himself earned him even more admiration from fans, further cementing his status as a cultural icon. When asked if he held any grudges against Greg, Snoop simply shook his head. Nah, man. We all make mistakes. As long as you learn from them, that's what matters. Though Greg appreciated Snoop's forgiving attitude, the experience left a lasting impact on him. He began questioning his approach to work, not because he thought rules were unimportant, but because he understood now that strictness without empathy could lead to unnecessary conflict. Determined to grow from the incident, Greg started reading books on effective communication and customer service. He attended workshops and sought advice from mentors, vowing to become not just a better pilot, but a better person. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, Greg received an unexpected email. It was from someone claiming to be part of Snoop Dogg's team. Intrigued, he opened it cautiously. To his astonishment, the message included an invitation to attend a charity gala hosted by none other than Snoop himself. The note read, "We know things got off to a rocky start, but we believe in second chances. Hope to see you there." Greg stared at the screen, unsure whether to laugh or cry. For weeks he wrestled with the idea of attending, worried about facing Snoop again after everything that had happened. Yet deep down he knew this was an opportunity to apologize properly, to show humility, and perhaps even to rebuild trust. With a mix of nerves and determination, Greg accepted the invitation, hoping the event would mark the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for both men involved in the unforgettable mix-up. The charity gala was held in a grand ballroom, adorned with sparkling chandeliers, plush carpets, and elegant decorations that screamed sophistication. Greg arrived feeling like an outsider, his suit slightly too stiff, and his tie just a bit too tight. He clutched the invitation in one hand as if it were a lifeline, scanning the room nervously for any sign of Snoop Dogg. The event buzzed with energy. Celebrities mingled with philanthropists, laughter echoed off the walls, and soft jazz music floated through the air. It was worlds away from the cockpit or the sterile environment of an airport terminal. As Greg stepped further into the venue, he couldn't help but feel out of place. Here he was, a pilot who had once blocked a global superstar from boarding his own plane, now standing among some of the most influential people in entertainment and business. Every glance felt like scrutiny, every smile a potential smirk. But before self-doubt could take over, a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Yo, man! Over here!" Greg turned to see Snoop Dogg waving at him from across the room, surrounded by friends and admirers. Despite the crowd around him, Snoop's attention was focused squarely on Greg. For a brief second, Greg froze, unsure how to react. Then, gathering his courage, he walked over, forcing a polite smile onto his face. "Hey, Mr. Broadus," Greg began awkwardly, extending his hand. "Thank you for inviting me tonight. I really appreciate it." Snoop grinned widely, shaking Greg's hand firmly. "Man, stop calling me Mr. Broadus, that's my daddy's name," he joked, drawing chuckles from those nearby. "Call me Snoop. We cool, all right?" The warmth in Snoop's tone immediately put Greg at ease. Instead of judgment or resentment, there was only kindness, an unexpected generosity that made Greg feel less like a blundering fool and more like a guest welcomed into someone's home. Snoop introduced Greg to his team and a few close friends, casually recounting the airport incident as though it were a funny anecdote rather than a professional disaster. "This is the guy I told you all about," Snoop said, pointing to Greg. "Blocked me from my own plane, but hey, rules are rules, right?" Everyone laughed, including Greg, though his laugh carried a hint of nervousness. Still, the ice had been broken. And what followed was an evening filled with conversation, shared stories, and even moments of genuine connection. As they talked, Greg learned more about Snoop, not just the larger-than-life rapper, but the person behind the persona. Snoop spoke passionately about his charitable work, his love for his family, and his desire to give back to communities that needed support. In turn, Greg opened up about his dedication to aviation, his commitment to safety, and the lessons he'd learned since their infamous encounter. At one point during the night, Snoop pulled Greg aside for a private chat. Leaning in slightly, he said, "Look, man, I know you were just doing your job, and honestly, I respect that. Too many people don't care about following the rules these days. But sometimes life throws curveballs, and we gotta roll with them. You feel me?" Greg nodded earnestly. "I do, sir. I mean, Snoop, I messed up, no doubt about it. I should have handled things differently, and I'm sorry for putting you in that position." Snoop waved off the apology with a dismissive gesture. "Nah, man, let it go. Like I said, mistakes happen. What matters is what you do after, and look at you. You came here tonight ready to make amends. That says a lot about you." By the end of the evening, Greg realized something profound. This wasn't just about redemption. It was about growth. Meeting Snoop Dogg face to face, seeing his humility and grace firsthand, reminded Greg of the importance of balance in life. Rules mattered, yes, but so did understanding, compassion, and the ability to adapt when circumstances demanded it. As the gala wound down and guests began to leave, Greg found himself smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks. Walking out of the ballroom, he glanced back to see Snoop waving goodbye, still radiating that same easygoing charm. For the first time since the incident, Greg didn't feel weighed down by regret. Instead, he felt hopeful, ready to embrace the lessons he'd learned and move forward with renewed purpose. In the weeks following the charity gala, the story of Greg and Snoop Dogg continued to captivate the public. News outlets picked up on the heartwarming twist, reporting how the two men had turned a potentially damaging situation into an opportunity for growth and reconciliation. Social media buzzed with reactions as people praised both Greg's willingness to own up to his mistake and Snoop's graciousness in forgiving him. The hashtag #JohnerSecondChances trended alongside memes showing Snoop and Greg shaking hands, with captions like "From blocked to BFFs" and "When life gives you lemons, make lemonade." For Greg, the aftermath was bittersweet. On one hand, he was relieved that the incident hadn't ended his career. His employer reinstated him to active duty after completing a brief review period, acknowledging his professionalism despite the error. However, the experience left a lasting impression on him, forcing him to reevaluate not just his approach to work, but also how he interacted with others. He realized that while rules were important, they needed to be balanced with empathy and open communication. At aviation forums and industry discussions, the incident sparked heated debates about protocol versus flexibility. Some pilots and airline staff defended Greg's actions, arguing that strict adherence to rules was essential for safety. Others criticized his rigidity, suggesting that over-reliance on procedures could alienate passengers and create unnecessary conflicts. One senior pilot even wrote an op-ed titled, "The Human Factor: Why Rules Alone Aren't Enough," using Greg's story as a case study. The article argued that while protocols existed to protect everyone involved, they shouldn't override common sense or basic human decency. Meanwhile, Snoop Dogg emerged from the ordeal unscathed, celebrated for his poise and humor under pressure. Fans admired his ability to laugh at himself and diffuse tension, qualities that made him beloved worldwide. During interviews, he often brought up the incident, turning it into a light-hearted tale about the importance of patience and understanding. "Man, I've been through worse," he quipped during a late-night talk show appearance. "At least this time nobody got mad enough to call the cops." His jokes resonated with audiences, further endearing him to fans who appreciated his ability to find humor in life's quirks. Despite their vastly different worlds, Greg and Snoop stayed in touch after the gala. They exchanged occasional texts, with Snoop checking in to see how Greg was doing. At first, Greg hesitated to respond, feeling unworthy of such kindness from someone so iconic. But Snoop's genuine warmth eventually won him over. Their conversations ranged from casual updates about work and family to deeper reflections on life. Snoop shared stories about overcoming challenges early in his career, offering advice on resilience and self-belief. Greg, in turn, opened up about his struggles with perfectionism and fear of failure. Inspired by Snoop's encouragement, Greg decided to share his own story publicly. He wrote a heartfelt post on social media, thanking Snoop for his forgiveness and sharing what he'd learned from the experience. I used to think being professional meant sticking rigidly to the rules, Greg wrote. But now I know that true professionalism is about balancing those rules with compassion and understanding. Mistakes are part of life, but how we handle them defines us. The post went viral, earning thousands of likes and comments from people praising his honesty and vulnerability. As time passed, Greg noticed subtle changes in himself. He became more patient with passengers, taking extra care to listen before jumping to conclusions. Colleagues remarked on his newfound calmness under pressure, noting how he handled difficult situations with grace rather than frustration. Even his supervisor complimented him, saying, "You've grown a lot since that day. Keep it up." For Snoop, the incident reinforced something he already knew, that kindness often speaks louder than anger. By choosing to forgive Greg instead of holding a grudge, he demonstrated leadership and maturity, traits that inspired countless fans around the globe. People began referring to him not just as a music legend, but as a role model for handling adversity with dignity. By the end of it all, what started as a simple misunderstanding blossomed into a story of redemption, humility, and unlikely friendship. Both Greg and Snoop walked away changed, not because of the conflict itself, but because of the way they chose to resolve it. And though their lives remained worlds apart, the bond they formed served as a reminder that even the most awkward moments can lead to meaningful connections if approached with an open heart. Quen, 2.5 Max 11:36 p.m. months after the incident at the airport, Greg found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed. What began as a humiliating mix-up had transformed into one of the most defining moments of his career, and perhaps even his life. He often thought about the charity gala and the unexpected friendship that blossomed between him and Snoop Dogg. It wasn't just the lessons he'd learned. It was the way those lessons had reshaped his perspective on work, relationships, and himself. One crisp morning, Greg received an email from Snoop's team inviting him to attend another event, a private concert in Los Angeles to benefit underprivileged youth. This time there was no hesitation. Greg replied immediately, expressing his gratitude and excitement. When the day arrived, he dressed carefully, choosing a smart casual outfit that struck the perfect balance between professional and relaxed. As he entered the venue, he spotted Snoop almost instantly. The rapper greeted him with a warm hug, introducing him to friends and collaborators as if they'd known each other for years. During the concert, Greg sat among the crowd, marveling at the energy and passion radiating from the stage. Watching Snoop perform, he couldn't help but admire the man's ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Whether it was through music, humor, or simple acts of kindness, Snoop had a gift for making others feel seen and valued. For Greg, this realization hit home in a profound way. He realized that being a pilot wasn't just about flying planes, it was about serving people, ensuring their safety, while also treating them with respect and care. After the show, Snoop invited Greg backstage for a quick chat. Over drinks and snacks, they talked about everything from upcoming projects to personal goals. At one point, Snoop leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, man, I gotta thank you too." Greg looked up, surprised. "Thank me? For what?" "For reminding me why I love doing what I do," Sop replied with a grin. "That day at the airport? Yeah, it was wild, but it reminded me how important it is to stay humble and keep things light, even when stuff gets crazy. And hey, now we got a story nobody can top." Those words stayed with Greg long after the night ended. They weren't just a compliment. They were validation that growth could come from the most unlikely places. Since the incident, Greg had made a conscious effort to apply the lessons he'd learned. He became more adaptable, more willing to listen, and more focused on building connections rather than enforcing rigid rules. Passengers noticed the change, often commenting on how pleasant and personable he'd become. Even his colleagues remarked on his transformation, joking that he seemed like a completely different person. As for Snoop, the experience reinforced his belief in second chances and the power of forgiveness. By choosing to extend grace instead of holding on to anger, he turned what could have been a negative moment into something positive, not just for himself, but for Greg and everyone who heard the story. Fans admired him not only for his talent but for his character, proving that true greatness lies in how we treat others, especially during challenging times. The bond between the two men continued to grow over the months. Occasionally, Greg would send Snoop updates about his flights or share stories about passengers he'd helped. In return, Snoop would check in with words of encouragement, reminding Greg to stay confident and trust himself. Their friendship became a testament to the idea that meaningful connections can form in the most unexpected ways. Looking back, Greg couldn't help but smile at the irony of it all. A single misstep had led to so much growth, not just professionally, but personally. He learned that mistakes weren't failures unless you refused to learn from them. And sometimes those lessons came wrapped in humor, humility, and the wisdom of someone like Snoop Dogg. For both men, the incident served as a reminder that life is unpredictable, and that's what makes it beautiful. Whether it's navigating turbulence in the skies or in our daily lives, the key is to stay grounded, embrace challenges, and never underestimate the power of kindness. After all, every encounter, no matter how awkward or chaotic, has the potential to teach us something valuable, leaving us better equipped to face whatever comes next.